important for the Azores. A little bit about the Azores also, and now we'll move to the last part of the talk, which is the Azorians leaving for the New World. So we began populating the Azores, as I mentioned, in the 1430s, but basically in the late 1400s and early 1500s. And then we, of course, went to, as soon as we're there, seems like about 50 or 60 years, we wanted to leave. And so 275 years ago, our first families went to Brazil. All of southern Brazil was populated by the Azorians. The first were a group of 70 families. That's a lot of people from a group of islands, which is a few 100,000 people. Over 200 years ago to the United States, and of course over 150 years ago to California. And our first incursions were really the whale hunters, and mostly from the islands of Flores, Pico, São Jorge, a little bit of São Miguel. Those were the islands that had a strong tradition in whale hunting. And those were our first immigrants. Those were our first immigrants to the United States. They would come in whaling ships. They would jump ship, and they would not go back. They would take skeleton crews to the Azores because they wanted to bring lots and lots of all of the products that the whales that you could manufacture from the whales. And so they would obviously recruit in the Azores, and some people would agree, and some jump ship, and some jumped ship without even them knowing about it. People would find out that there were people on board when they had been on board for 2 or 3. There's wonderful stories in the Portuguese literary world based on historical data of how some people would jump from the waters of São Jorge or the waters of Pico and go into a whaling boat, which is amazing to the amount of courage. This is one of our most famous paintings, and it's by a gentleman by the name of Domingos Rebelo, and it kind of shows the Azores of the 19th century and the 20th century. And you can look at these people and say, well, this is probably, what, 1890, 1910? No, we dressed like that in the 1950s in the Azores. So it's not, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, it wasn't just something. The Azores were, immigration from the Azores wasn't because people were going on an adventure, or although we had a monarchy that didn't pay any attention to us, and then we had a brutal dictatorship for 50 years, people didn't leave the Azores for civil liberties or for freedom or for anything. They left the Azores because they were poor, and they wanted a better opportunity. It was a very, very poor place. Just skip that a little bit. So our arrival here. So we have a couple of waves of immigration, 1860 to 1921, and there's a wonderful exhibit that I have the privilege of having a copy of it, that was done by our Honorable Judge William Silveira and a group of friends of his. That is a wonderful book that should be published in the book form. We need to do that. It's called Beloved Immigrants, and it was an exhibit that was done interstate in 1989. And it talks about the Azorians coming, and Portuguese in general, mostly Azorians coming to Tulare and Kings County in those early days. And then, so in 1921, things stopped a little bit. And why? We had our first Immigration Act. Those of you who know, who are historians, know that. So the Immigration Act of 1921, as you can see, they set quotas for the Portuguese, basically to 2,520, I should say, and then actually 2,465 from there on. So, and the numbers are kind of fascinating to me anyway. So in 1921, right before, or as the immigration law was being processed, we had 19,000 people, a little over 19,000 people that came from Portugal, mostly from the Azores, to the United States. In the total decade from 1920 to 1929 was only 29,000. So only 10,000 more came because we had the immigration law was very skewed, and if you read the law, I read the law for a project I was doing, and I was kind of flabbergasted. I should have been, but I was. The law was very punitive to what it called the dark Europeans. And who were the dark Europeans? The Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Greeks, the Turks. The Italians. And so it was very, I mean, we went from 19,000 people to 2,500. Now, that's not to say that a few of them didn't come over clandestinely, but legally, that's the number. And so then, of course, we had the Great Depression, we had World War II, and immigration was just very sparse. Until 1958, when we had, 57, 58, a volcanic eruption in the Azores, in the island of Fayal. It actually affected only about 250 people. But the Portuguese community lobbied a young guy, very aggressive guy, good looking according to the women, named John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who was a senator from Massachusetts with a very, very strong Portuguese community. And they convinced JFK that, no, it affected 10,000 people. And JFK didn't bother, he didn't have Google, he didn't go to Google, in 1958. So he believed him. And so he did the first Azorian, it's called the Azorian Refugee Act in 1958 that allowed 1,500 people. And then a second version later on that allowed another 2,500 people. And so, and then of course after that, the Immigration and Naturalization Act, which is still in the books, it's part of the law of the books from 1965, and the Family Reunification Act, and then the numbers changed immensely. So from 1950 to 1959, that decade, we had 14,000, a little over 14,000 people come over. But looking from 60 to 69, 73,000. So a big, big change. And what happened? The Family Reunification Act. So these folks who had come over under the Azorian Refugee Act, at the end of 5 years, they became U.S. citizens, and they could bring their mom, their dad, their brother, their sister, and that just happened. That happened. And so you had those who had been here before, because, for example, I had two aunts who came over before 1965. My grandfather, a bit of personal history, my grandfather immigrated here in 1910. And he lived here for 18 years, and he had a dairy in Woodville. And he left back. He sold his dairy in 1928, 6 months before the Great Depression. So he was a lucky man. Had he had waited another 6 months, he would have not been able to sell anything. And he went back, and he actually, is a wonderful story because my grandfather went to work at the age of 8, and at the age of 18 he left, 19, and had been working for this man for 11 years. And he told the guy, I'm going to America to make money, but I'll be back. And the guy said, yeah, everybody says that, so I'll never see you again. And he said, no, I'll be back. He said, I'll tell you what, if you come back, as you know, I'm single. I have nobody to inherit this. I don't like my nephews and my nieces. He told that to my grandfather. Used to tell his stories. I don't like my nephews and my nieces. So if you want to buy this, I'll sell it to you. In 1928, 18 years later, my grandfather went back with his wife and 5 daughters, and he bought 143 alqueires, which are Portuguese acres, a vineyard, and a house from that man. And he lived in my grandfather's house until he died. But he was lucky. And so my two aunts were born here. But even with a little bit of land, we couldn't make a good living. I mean, we talk about how things are. People, the American dream is to own a house. My mom and my dad owned a house ever since they were born. It's their mom's house, but it's just, my dad worked and could not make a living. He couldn't make a living to put food on the table, but not to advance himself at all. And so the system was so corrupt and so vicious during the Salazar dictatorship that we couldn't grow. And so two of my aunts came because they were American citizens. So if you're an American citizen, you could come over and bring your husband and your wife with you and your kids. But other than that, you couldn't come to the United States unless you were within that 2,500 tops. So our first immigrants, of course, and if you saw a little bit of the video that we did in the documentary by Fresno State, were sheep herders, and Judge Bill Silveira talks about that. And of course, there's a couple of pictures there of some of our first immigrants. And then, of course, as all of you know, we got involved heavily in agriculture and dairy production. And according to Dr. Ramiro Dutra, who was an agricultural professor at Pomona State in the 1970s, the Portuguese controlled about 50 to 55% of the dairy industry in California. Wow. And that's huge, It's not the same today, obviously, but there is still a big influence of Portuguese in agriculture. By the way, that bottom picture is my grandfather's ranch here in Woodville. And then, of course, with immigration came assimilation, and came integration, and came name changes, and came all kinds of things that I would like to talk to you about, but I'm going to it real quick. And some of our traditions that are still part of the American world, and of religion also played a very, very big part. I think if it wasn't, there's a few things that if they had not happened, the Portuguese wouldn't have their cultural connection. This is just a little bit, those of you who know Tulare know, of course, these organizations. So the TDS, which is over 100 years old, and if you look at those, all of those organizations, the soccer hall, as it's called, La Negrense, Carrillo Club, and I put Carrillo with two options, double L or LH, because if he's Portuguese, he'd be LH, he wouldn't be double L. And the reason I say is if, it's because there's a big controversy over that now. The Portuguese Cultural Center at St. Al, CPC, the Portuguese Marching Band, and then there at the bottom, the Portuguese Press, Portuguese Radio, and Portuguese Television. All of these organizations shaped who we are today. We wouldn't be the same community. And all of these organizations, other than TDS, are basically post-1950. Okay, and for example, the Carrillo Club, we may have not had the number of people becoming American citizens if it wasn't for the Carrillo Club and their American Citizen Program. And that's how it allowed other people to come. And some of these other organizations continued, most of these organizations like the Soccer Hall, the CPC at St. Al's, the Philharmonic, the Portuguese Band, these are all post Capelinho's volcano eruption organization. And just a little bit, look at this newspaper. It's called Lavrador Português, and if you can't see it, obviously it's very small print, the other part, which means the Portuguese farmer. This newspaper was published here in Tulare, and as you can see the date, you cannot see it up there, but it's on top of there, on the 17th of June of 1921. So during the 1920s, we had a newspaper, semi-weekly, published in Tulare, and look at the things that they talked about. So the first, there's the right. They talked about Russia, 1921, and Russia and Europe, and then there you see it in English, but the story's in Portuguese. Farmers Protective Association, so an organization of Portuguese farmers that were kind of the very first co-op in order to protect their lands and protect their farms. So to me, it's interesting that today we don't have a Portuguese newspaper, but in 1920s we did, and so it was a different community. And if you ever have time, these are available online. They're all been digitalized, and so if you look at it, the ads are fascinating. The ads are really fascinating. The First National Bank of Tulare and Lovett's used cars, and so all of the different businesses that existed, and that made it a point to advertise in the Portuguese. And so from this, of course, was born the Tulare Younger Sister City Foundation. As all of you know, its purpose is, these are all three pictures of Angra. It's a beautiful city. If you have never been there, please visit. And the foundation, I think, has done the much needed job of bringing together not just the city of Angra and the island of Terceira, but I would think that the Azores and the Central Valley with some exchange programs such as things we have right now at Fresno State. These are some of the names that Don mentioned that are there, and I think these pioneers, there's others that are not, but I think these pioneers are all very, thanks to Don for doing this. Because when you look at Adeline Mello, I think that Larry is here. And congratulations on Larry for being elected supervisor for Tulare County. Mrs. Mello literally spent her life getting people to become American citizens. She spent her life helping people, taking people to the DMV, taking people to the hospital, to the doctor's office. She would close her store. She had the Golden Thimble. She would close the store and take people. Try to find somebody to do that today. And of course, Spike Mancebo, and the empire that he built. But what he did, I mean, he's invested heavily in the Azores had a ship boat to bring people from São Jorge when they were ill to Terceira because they had no hospital. Joseph Soares, which is another wonderful story, his commitment to the sister city. Casey Santos, which is the son of Inácio and Margarida Santos, the first Portuguese radio program in Tulare, 1937. Rosie Silveira and her work as being the very first woman president of a fraternal society. That was a no-no until of a male and female. The Portuguese societies had to start their own. The women had to start their own society because the men wouldn't let them in. And of course, our own mayor, Diniz Borges, and his work on behalf of the Sister City Foundation, Carrillo Club, and other organizations. Here to your right is just something I wanted to share with you. Is that for the third year in a row, it's happened now for 7 years, but the third year in a row we have just introduced on June 1st of 2022 the Senate's concurrent resolution to honor the Portuguese in California and declaring the month of June Portuguese Heritage Month, but also doing something that to me is very important, and that is declaring June 6th as the Azores Day. Sometimes people in mainland Portugal get a little bit with their feathers ruffled, but it's not that we want to be independent. We will be someday, but it's because if there are 350,000 Californians who claim to be of Portuguese background, that's the official number of the census. Of those, 92% are from the Azores. So I just told recently our new Consul General, you want to understand the community? Understand the Azores. The Portuguese presence in California goes through the Azores, whether we want to or not. There are two things that are important to Americans as far as Portugal is concerned. That Lajes Air Base in Terceira, which some of you have been there, where the airplanes land, that was built by the U.S. Air Force. It's a military base. And when people say, oh, it's not important, the various administrations have had different look at that. Oh, it's not important, nowadays we can do well. I was just there 2 weeks ago for a conference of Portuguese press. And I have been there many times, and I've never seen, and they were right, I've been there many times in the last 20 years. I've saw maybe 3 or 4 planes. There were 28 fighter jets on the tarmac there, U.S. fighter jets, because of the Ukrainian situation, Ukrainian war. And so that base continues to be very important. And that base is the basis for the relationship between the United States and Portugal. So a little bit as we end. So the Azores, basically tradition and innovation. So we still have bullfights. But we also have things that are new to the Azores, such as whale watching, not whale hunting anymore, whale watching, okay? As you can see there, that's in São Jorge. I did that for Carmen's sake. Some of the trilhos, some of the hikes in São Jorge are the most beautiful you can do in the Azores, certainly in the Azores. And the left one there is in the island of Flores. So now new sports and new things, and the Azores are totally, totally different. And what we have to do with the community basically is, and just with a brief reflection, is also to continue that tradition, but also to look at innovation and to register our stories. And I have here, as you see the picture of our good friend Bill Silveira, because one of the things that I'm heavily involved in since I retired from high school is the capturing of the oral history. And I'd love to have the oral history from all of you. People tell me I don't have a history. Everybody has a history. And you have the history of your mom and your dad, or your grandfather or your grandmother. And let me just be bold, you owe it to them to register that history. Because if we don't do that, historians didn't used to like, and Mr. Lawton can tell that, and Mr. Berger as well, a lot of historians didn't like oral histories many years ago. It was just that. But today's historians really have a different outlook on oral history, because sometimes history can be top down, and oral history kind of gives a very horizontal look at history, because it collects the history of the people, and that then of course makes the history of the country and of our area. This is just a little bit about our Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute. So thank you all. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer any of them. I took just a little bit longer because there wasn't any entertainment, so that was the entertainment as well. And so thank you all for your kind attention. hopefully that gave you a little bit of a background of Portugal, how it progressed, the Azores, and how we came to America. Just recently, a young man, Jewish American, married to a Portuguese granddaughter of immigrants from Chile, called me. He was involved in that production of that show, Dancing with the Stars. Really knows Hollywood well, and he's doing a documentary, which I hope to see it on mainstream television, on the Azorians post the Capelinhos volcano. So the immigration and the presence of the Azores after 1958. And he called me and wanted to interview me, and was at my house for about an hour. We talked for about an hour, and obviously he'll use about 35 seconds of it. And he asked me, what were the Azores like? You know, you left at 10 years old. What do you remember? And I said, a sad place.
A what?
A sad place. And he looked at me and he said, I've interviewed 28 people. I have never heard that. Everybody has something. It's paradise. It's heaven on earth. It's, you know, blah 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 blah. And you tell me it's 1968 when you left, it was a sad place. And I said, well, you know, Gabriel Garcia Marquez used to say, the famous Latin American novelist, that sometimes the distance in years make, when you tell histories of the heart, it kind of distances a little bit the truth and the reality, because you romanticize it. But in 1968, when my family left the Azores, we were crying because our aunts and our uncles and our cousins were leaving the Azores to go to America and to Canada. So there was immigration. Every week a family left in our village. So is that a happy place? You lose your friends? Second of all, we were crying because our young Portuguese men between the ages of 18 and 22 were coming back in body bags from a brutal colonial war in Africa. And those who didn't come back in the body bag came back with lots of issues. And so, because they weren't prepared for the little war that was going on, obviously, and war is what it is. And so it was this very sad place. It is no longer that sad place. It's actually a very happy place now, still with lots of issues. But that's for another talk. Anyway, thank you so much. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them for you.